Did we work more in the Middle Ages than we do today? We often imagine our ancestors in the Middle Ages as being hard workers, able to work long, tiring days in the field. This goes against our current work rhythms. However, the reality of working hours in the Middle Ages will surprise you, as it is quite far from the stereotypes we spontaneously think of. I will share with you in a few minutes an answer to this subject, which is the result of my readings of historians, medievalists, French-speaking as well as English-speaking, whose work I have consulted for you. As for the working hours of our medieval ancestors, we are going to address the subject, focusing on the 14th century, that is to say the 1300s, which is both a pivotal and particular era, while being well documented, thus allowing us to grasp a whole part of the medieval logic on this subject. Also note that practices were not homogeneous and varied according to territories, while having evolved according to the different eras making up what we call the Middle Ages. So, in your opinion, what was the way they counted working time back then? In the Middle Ages in the West, the work time unit was the day, not the hour like today. For the populations, whether rural or urban, the starting point for organizing workdays was defined both by nature and religious practices. Did a workday last from sunrise to sunset? Yes, because at this pace it happened without realizing it. In theory, this represents from 8.5 hours of work per day in winter up to exhausting 16-hour days in summer. But as we will see, the medieval reality was different, whether in the countryside or in the city, while being curiously less distant from ours than one might think. In rural areas, people's work varied based on their social standing. The serfs, peasants tied to their land, were highly dependent on a work structure imposed by their overlords. Free men had more freedom regarding work as long as they paid taxes. In practice, the lordly authority over work organization varied greatly by territory, gradually shifting in favor of the peasants, regardless of status. Often strong in the case of serfs, it could be almost non-existent in the case of free men. In fact, rural populations, especially free men, organized themselves into rural communities, most often operating through village assemblies. One of their roles was to collectively determine the organization of work. In some lordships, serf communities with a special status could also adopt collective operation by pooling the working hours that were due to the suzerains to organize themselves as desired in this matter. In short, in medieval countryside, the way of organizing work was far from homogeneous and there were very diverse modes of operation. Here's a practical example to help you visualize how this could work. Historian Bennett thus shares the operation of English manors, within which the workdays owed to the lords, particularly the serfs, were in reality only half-days, beginning at sunrise but ending around noon. This may seem strange, but it's actually quite logical. We're discussing the time a subject owes their suzerain, not the time they work in a day. In fact, the peasant also has to meet his own needs, and to do this, he obviously has to be able to work his own crops. And that's what they did when they were freed from their obligations. But then, what about the working hours of these populations? Peasants were estimated to be active from about an hour after sunrise until nightfall, with some periods being especially busy. However, they did not work continuously during this period. In fact, it was around a maximum of 12 hours a day, which is already lengthy for physical work. So why 12 hours at most? Well, the peasants took several breaks in their day to eat, refresh themselves, or simply rest, for example, through naps. Conversely, winter was typically a calmer time for work, which was consequently slowed by the season. The rural populations utilized the freed-up time from this period to tinker and spend quality time together. Added to this were holidays, including Sundays, and numerous religious or affiliated celebrations, the quantity of which has changed over time. Historian Christine Bareilles and others estimate the number to be over 100. The number of days off per year at the end of the 13th century, which is more than a quarter of the year, although it should be noted that these days off were not always strictly observed. In brief, estimating the exact number of hours worked yearly by rural populations is challenging. This is due to the lack of uniformly imposed and respected standards, as well as the visibility of hours worked outside the seigneurial context. However, the internet often features calculations by sociologist Juliet Shore, whose aim was to provide perspective rather than rigorous historical analysis. Medieval peasants typically worked between 1,440 and 1,620 hours per year. However, upon reading the works of various historians for this video, it appears to me to be more than likely that these calculations omit a whole part of the work not accounted for by the administrative bodies of the lordships, and as a result, much more difficult to quantify, as I mentioned. But I'm not going to leave you hanging, and I'm going to offer you an answer that you can also adapt according to what makes sense to you, with all the limitations that this type of exercise presents, of course. So, based on what we have seen in a theoretical calculation, where we consider that a peasant had 100 days off, which were respected, worked 12 hours a day, 100 days a year, so let's say 100 days a year, and worked, let's say, 6 hours a day the rest of the time, so 165 days. The annual work volume is approximately 2,200 hours. In fact, this hourly volume aligns more closely with the practices at the time. In a different environment that we will see right away, the cities in the Middle Ages adopted a work organization that was quite different and much more structured than the countryside. This will simplify identifying the annual working time of medieval urban populations. The basic logic of this work organization also relied on sunrise and sunset with an important nuance. At the time, these were what we call guilds, which were essentially groupings of craftsmen, merchants, and others who determined and structured the workday. It is the conventions and rules of these guilds, some of which have indeed reached us, that allow us to have a clear vision of the number of hours worked in Western Europe by a large part of the urban populations. In fact, at the time, each workday in the city included at least 2 breaks, particularly for eating, each lasting 30 minutes to an hour. While the day ended either at vespers, that is to say generally around 4 o'clock, or accomplished, typically at dusk, around 6 or 7 p.m. The start of the workday in the city varied based on trades and seasons. In general, urban workers typically worked 8-9 hours daily in winter and 10-12 hours in summer. The start of the day therefore varied depending on whether it ended at vespers or at compline. So this indeed gives us an idea, but what about the non-working days? Were there weekends or weekend days like ours? And were there vacations? Well, you're going to be surprised, but the answer is yes to at least one of these 2 questions. So, for city dwellers too, Sunday as well as religious celebrations. Mandatory non-working days were enforced with penalties for any work done on those days. So we arrive at a total of 80 to 85 days per year that were not worked, if we trust the estimates of Etienne Martin Saint-Léon. According to recent authors, there are over 100 theoretical holidays with varying degrees of observance in practice, compared to an average of 130 days off currently. Additionally, we must count the days with reduced work hours, usually ending at noon or 4 p.m., varying by trade and period. This includes all Saturdays and religious holiday eves throughout the year. This represents about 70 half-days not worked per year, which thus allows mathematically to draw 35 additional days off. Thus, we reach a total of over 130 days, potentially not worked per year, in 215 AD, much more similar to our current situation. That being said, the number of hours worked annually by our urban ancestors remains higher than what we know today. Everyone worked on average, smoothing out the seasonal variations mentioned earlier, between 10.5 hours per day and 235 to 250 days or year. That's an annual total of 2,115 to 2,625 hours worked per year, compared to under 1,700 hours for an employee today, and 2,250 hours for the self-employed. These are self-employed individuals, such as professionals, craftsmen, and small to medium-sized business owners. You might wonder why I'm not addressing the nobility and clergy's case. These, having a special status and role, do not fit well into this historical analysis of working time due to a very simple reason. As we know so well, their mode of operation deviates from this logic to fit into a completely different paradigm. Beyond the fact that they represent only a minority of the population, it therefore does not make much sense to address the issue of working time in their case. In conclusion, what we understand from this analysis is that today's workers, overall, have a much more comfortable work life, from both a time perspective as well as from a vacation perspective, than what they had in the Middle Ages. It's worth noting that the yearly working hours of modern self-employed individuals are similar to those in the Middle Ages. However, this volume of hours hides a big difference between the mindset of that time and ours. The most important thing being that the days not worked at that time did not resemble our current holidays at all, spread throughout the year and defined by the authorities. In those days, there were numerous restrictions and prohibitions, limiting one's freedom to act as desired. Importantly, these days went unpaid due to lack of work, which could cause tensions for low-wage jobs and during times of inflation. In short, you've understood. We are equally distant from the medieval fantasy of ancestors, toiling like galley slaves until death, and the recent cliché of the medieval worker, who would have worked only half the year, while he would have spent the other resting and enjoying his free time without constraint. Still work. Thanks for watching. Comment if this answered your question. I'm always very interested in reading your comments. And of course, don't forget to give a thumbs up and subscribe. It's free and it supports my work. With that, I suggest you watch the first video of our new series. This month, we're revisiting the heroes of 1940. The book dispels many cliches about the 1940 Battle of France, while immersing readers in the fury of the era's battles. To stay in the medieval spirit, let's explore whether our medieval ancestors retired. See you soon.